In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Please be seated. When I began work on this sermon several days ago, I had a sermon about the fear Joseph must have felt when his brothers grabbed him with the intention of murder. And I had a sermon about the fear of the disciples when they saw the impossibility of Jesus walking on the water. And now I have a sermon that makes me afraid. It makes me afraid because speaking about social issues always irritates people. And because whenever I speak about uncomfortable things, somebody always gets angry at me. At least I can comfort myself that it's just a sermon among people I know who are not likely to threaten me, I hope. The most you're likely to do is to fume and sort of grumble behind my back, and I can live with that. And yet, that also makes me a little afraid. Afraid that the gospel today will have no impact on anyone. That it'll change no hearts, move no minds closer to the will of God, or that I'm just preaching to the choir. What I'm afraid of course, is speaking about the events in Charlottesville, Virginia, at the University of Virginia and the surrounding area. You know, they just took place. They're still going on. And it does make me afraid to talk about it. And yet, I would be more afraid not to speak about it because I would have to answer to God for my silence. And I guarantee you, nearly every pulpit throughout this country and many around the world will be filled with the same message. That message is that the group marching down there with torches and weapons, shouting Nazi slogans like blood and soil, that group that surrounded a church filled with peaceful, worshiping counter-protesters, that group has nothing to do with the gospel of Jesus Christ. Their method is to instill fear. And their message is one of fear. This group, which is alternately called the alt-right, or white nationalists, or white supremacists, but who embrace the spirit and message of Nazism, this group wants you to be afraid. And they're not coy about it either. One of these neo-Nazis tweeted a message yesterday that has been retweeted amongst the leaders of several white nationalist groups. And the message said this: "The fear we instill in them today only fuels our victory tomorrow." These groups want people of color to be afraid. They want them to know their place. When they shouted, "We will not be replaced," what they meant was that they don't want to lose their place as the most privileged group in the country. They do not want to become a minority because they know how minorities are treated here, because they're the ones doing it. They know that people of color don't get the same bank loans, don't get the same jobs, don't get the same educational opportunities, or the same safety afforded to them by the government. They know this. And they want it. They want you to be afraid. Whoever you are, even if you, like me, am a white male, like the overwhelming majority of them. They want you to be cowed so that you don't speak up. so that you don't say anything when they insult and abuse others. Fear is their weapon and their message. But it is not the message of God. It is not the message of Jesus Christ. When Joseph was grabbed by his brothers who didn't want their position of privilege to be taken away from them by him, he had to feel terrified. He knew what they were going to do. How close did they get to beating him to death? When they threw him in a pit, he had to be afraid. What were his chances of dying of exposure or thirst? And when they sold him into slavery, what could he have felt other than fear? And yet he knew God was with him. He trusted God. He trusted the dreams that God gave him, and he trusted that God would not abandon him. When the disciples saw Jesus walking on water, they were terrified. Ghosts held a much more vivid and frightening place in people's imaginations back then than they do today, because we see him on the screen all the time. Not only that, but we have nights that are lit up with electrical lights. And they had nights with no illumination whatsoever. They really knew darkness and fear. And yet, as Jesus approached, he said to them, "Do not be afraid." And he said, "You of little faith, why do you doubt?" It's not unlike the time when he was asleep on the boat when a fierce storm struck that threatened to sink the boat. And the once again terrified disciples woke him up with cries of, "Don't you care that we're about to drown?" And again, he said, "Why are you afraid? I'm with you." That is our question today. Why are we afraid? God is with us. A friend and colleague of mine, one who was part of the Indaba team with me when we traveled to England and India, she was in that church the other night that was surrounded by those torch-bearing neo-Nazis when they were praying and the building was surrounded by them so that they couldn't leave. She said they were simply praying when it became clear that they weren't going to be allowed to leave the building. All the exits were blocked. While some feared the crowd outside, because who knew what they were going to do, she said the prevailing mood was of God's presence, was of God's peace. There was a calm about them because God was and is with them. Fear cannot and will not win. Now, as we all know, the abuse and intimidation of people of color in this country did not start in this past year. It has not been limited to this large crowd of angry white supremacists. This abuse has been going on for a very long time. And since it usually doesn't affect most of us, we usually say nothing. In fact, we usually don't even notice. And when we do say something, people get tired of it very quickly. They say, "Can't you think of something else to complain about? Didn't we deal with that a long time ago? Won't you people ever be satisfied?" And so we clam up. It is so easy, so tempting to let things go, to let things just roll along as they've been going along for so long. But if the gospel teaches us anything, and I'm talking about the entirety of the gospel, not just today's reading, it is that we are all God's children. Or as Paul said in the epistle today, there is no distinction between Jew and Greek. The same Lord is Lord of all and is generous to all who call on him. We are all God's children, wonderfully made and responsible to and for each other. How is it then that we can be too afraid or too disinterested to notice when our own family is being harmed? Unless, that is, we doubt that God is with us, or we doubt that Christ has called us to love each other. And unless we doubt every single person is worthy of respect. You of little faith, Jesus says, why do you doubt? I know people hate it whenever I speak about political topics. But politics is simply the manner in which we care for each other. And that is the core of the gospel as well. The events in Virginia teach us that we do not have the luxury of silence. Thankfully, neither do we need to fear when we are called upon to speak, because God is with us today and always. Amen.